Once, the greatest library the world had ever known stood beside the sea. Not as a monument to power, but as a promise to memory. Thousands of voices lived there. Poems that no one would ever write again. Maps of lands we no longer remember how to reach. And then, slowly, it began to vanish. Not in a single night of flames, but across wars, silence, neglect, and time. Tonight, we return to Alexandria, to understand not only how the library was lost, but why its idea never truly disappeared. Good evening, and welcome back to Noctivara Stories. Tonight, we walk toward the edge of the Mediterranean, where land narrows, water slows, and memory once tried to gather the whole world under one roof. We are in Alexandria. Not yet a ruin. Not yet a legend. But a city still forming its breath. This is the story of the Library of Alexandria. Not as a single room filled with scrolls, but as a living idea. A place where power and curiosity learned to sit beside one another. Where kings imagined permanence, and scholars worked quietly, knowing that time was never fully on their side. Tonight, we will move gently through its beginnings. We will meet the rulers who dreamed it into existence, the thinkers who gave it shape, and the ambitions that made it far more than stone and papyrus. This was a community devoted to learning in its broadest sense. Here, the sky was measured. The earth was calculated. Words were compared, translated, ordered, and preserved. Knowledge itself was treated as something that could be mapped. Within these walls, Euclid arranged geometry into forms that still hold. Eratosthenes followed the length of shadows and measured the size of the earth with nothing but sunlight and patience. Callimachus built a catalogue not of stars or ships, but of ideas, titles, authors, origins, so that memory would not collapse under its own weight. Translators worked line by line to shape Greek versions of Hebrew texts, allowing one tradition to speak softly to another across time. Scrolls arrived by ship. Languages brushed past one another in corridors and colonnades. And always, just beyond the scholarship, there pressed politics, rivalry, and belief. As we continue, we will return to the questions that never quite leave this place. How did the library truly begin? What did it actually contain? And what forces, slow or sudden, eventually scattered its contents into silence? Before we go further, take a moment to notice where you are listening from. Notice the hour. Whether you are preparing for sleep or simply resting your thoughts, allow the present day to loosen its grip. Let the noise thin. Let the pace slow. Tonight, the past does not rush us. The story begins on a narrow stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Merotis. Here, water surrounded the site from nearly every direction, and trade had passed for centuries before a city was named. In the spring of 331 before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon stood on this shore and imagined something new. He marked the outline of a city using barley flour poured onto the ground. Birds descended and scattered the grain almost immediately. Those watching took it as a sign. The city, they said, would never lack food. It would feed others, and others would feed it in return. The location was chosen with care. To the west lay deep, protected anchorages. To the south stretched Lake Merotis, which could be linked by canals to the Nile, opening a route to the grain fields of the delta and the river roads leading far inland. To the north and east, islands and reefs could be reshaped into natural defenses. A city here could look in multiple directions at once. It could speak Greek and Egyptian. It could trade with the Aegean, the Levant, and the Red Sea. It could become a hinge between worlds. Alexander entrusted the design to Dinocrates of Rhodes. The plan was orderly, almost mathematical. Broad avenues, Straight lines. A grid imposed on a flat, windy shore. The main road, the Canopic Way, ran east to west for several kilometers, wide enough for armies, ceremonies, and crowds moving without friction. The harbor was divided into two great basins. One for commerce, one for war. A massive causeway, the Heptastadion, stretched across the water to the island of Pharos. This single structure reshaped currents and created calm inner waters where ships could unload throughout the year. On Pharos, generations later, a lighthouse would rise. So tall, so bright, that its name would become the word for all beacons. Built of stone and crowned with fire, its light was amplified by polished metal mirrors. Sailors saw it long before land appeared. It announced Alexandria before the city itself could be seen. Alexander did not live to watch any of this mature. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, and his empire fractured almost immediately. Even his body became a prize. Ptolemy, one of his generals, seized it and brought it to Egypt, laying the embalmed king in a tomb within Alexandria's royal quarter. This was not only reverence. It was a statement. With Alexander's body resting in the city, Ptolemy claimed continuity. He took the name Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, and made Alexandria his capital. He built a state around it. Garrisons secured the delta. Fleets guarded the coast. Trade was encouraged, monitored, and taxed. Ptolemy ruled a city of many peoples. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, and traders from across the Mediterranean walked the same streets. To govern them, he mastered balance. In temples, he appeared as a pharaoh. In court, as a Macedonian king. The imagery was deliberate. A city of many tongues required shared symbols and steady coinage. The wealth of Alexandria flowed from the Nile. Each year, floodwaters turned silt into abundance. Grain moved north. Ships moved outward. Warehouses filled. Customs officials recorded the flow of goods: papyrus, glass, oil, wine, ivory, spices. The city became a ledger written in stone. People followed the trade. Doctors, scribes, philosophers, craftsmen. Districts formed with distinct rhythms and accents. Beneath the new grid lay Rakotes, an older Egyptian settlement. Nearby rose the Serapeum, where a carefully crafted god, Serapis, blended Greek philosophy with Egyptian tradition. Religion here was not only belief. It was policy. To rule such a place required more than soldiers and ships. It required knowledge. Surveys for taxation. Star charts for navigation. Medical texts for armies and citizens. Mathematics for engineers and builders. From this need grew an ambition that went further than administration. A house for all learning. Demetrius of Phalerum, an Athenian exile, advised the court. He argued that a ruler who possessed the knowledge of the past could shape the future. Under his influence, the Mausian was formed, a community supported by the state, where scholars lived, ate, debated, and worked together. Nearby rose rooms for storage. Scrolls were gathered, copied, labeled. Papyrus was harvested along the Nile. Ink was mixed. Catalogs were designed so memory could be found again. Books became instruments. A poem refined language. A medical text preserved life. A geometric proof improved irrigation and saved grain. From the sea, Alexandria revealed itself slowly. First the lighthouse, then the harbors, then the long straight road pulling the eye inland toward palaces, gardens, and shaded walkways. Here, the Library of Alexandria began, not as a myth, but as a fragile human effort to hold the world still long enough to understand it. And for a time, it worked. A traveler approaching Alexandria from the sea could turn inland and see the Serapeum rising gently on its hill, its broad stairways leading toward a precinct cooled by colonnades and shadow. From a distance, the city appeared youthful and assured, but its confidence was not accidental. Alexandria had been planned with intention. It was a city designed as an instrument, a carefully tuned mechanism meant to gather power, wealth, ideas, and memory itself. By the time Ptolemy passed his throne to his son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, Alexandria had grown beyond its origins as a naval outpost and trading port. It had become something rarer, a living argument about what a city could be. Peoples and languages met here. The waters of the Nile were joined to the open sea. A lighthouse rose at the edge of the world to soften the terror of the unknown. A god was shaped who spoke both Greek and Egyptian at once. And within quiet chambers near the royal quarter, a far more ambitious project began, the gathering of the words of the world. The Ptolemaic ambition was not merely territorial. They sought dominion over memory itself. Civilization, in all its voices and fragments, was to be collected, ordered, and made reachable from a single place. In the cool courtyards of the royal district, where fig trees cast shifting patterns of shade and the air carried the mingled scent of salt and gardens, the Ptolemies envisioned a sanctuary unlike any before. Not a monument of stone alone, but a refuge for thought. They called it the Mauseum, the home of the Muses, a shrine dedicated to every art of the mind. Within its grounds were lecture halls and covered walkways, dining rooms, and shaded gardens fed by channels from Lake Merotis. There were rooms for observing the stars when the desert air turned perfectly clear, and spaces for studying animals brought from distant lands. This was not simply a building. It was a community. Those who lived here were citizens of thought, supported by the state, free to devote their lives to turning curiosity into knowledge. The idea found its guide in Demetrius of Phalerum, a former ruler of Athens, fallen from favor, who sought refuge in Egypt. In Ptolemy, he found a king who understood that culture itself was a form of power. Demetrius advised him to gather scholars as other rulers gathered soldiers. Ptolemy, a veteran of Alexander's campaigns, immediately grasped the usefulness of the idea. To rule Egypt, he needed surveyors who could measure land precisely after the Nile withdrew. He needed physicians for garrisons, astronomers for navigation, grammarians to shape administrative language, and philosophers to educate future officials in law and reason. Beyond utility, he understood spectacle. A court that summoned wisdom from Greece, Egypt, and the wider world displayed a legitimacy greater than force alone. Ptolemy began the work. His son, Philadelphus, embraced it fully. Funds were assigned to cover housing, meals, and the tools of study. Scholars were exempted from taxes and civic duties. The crown employed scribes and copyists, cooks and gardeners, attendants who adjusted water clocks to mark lectures and debates. The regulations of the Mauseum read like the charter of a small city. Residents lived and dined together. They taught, argued, compiled, and wrote. The head of the institution bore a priestly title, a quiet reminder that learning itself had been placed under divine protection. Alongside this living academy grew the instrument that would make Alexandria immortal, the library. At first, it was little more than a habit, a royal obsession with acquiring written works wherever they could be found. Agents were dispatched across the islands and mainland markets, carrying sealed letters and heavy purses. They purchased private collections from men willing to trade memory for gold. They sought the oldest copies, trusting age more than fashion. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbors were searched. Any scrolls found aboard were taken to official scribes, carefully copied in practiced hands. The originals were retained. The ship owners received immaculate duplicates on gleaming papyrus. Knowledge flowed inward by appetite and by law. To sustain this system, an entire economy of writing had to flourish. In the Nile Delta, papyrus cutters harvested reeds, sliced the pith into ribbons, layered them crosswise, pressed them under weight, and polished the sheet smooth with ivory. The finest papyrus was reserved for royal use, its surface accepting ink without bleed. Ink makers blended soot with gum arabic and water, sometimes adding vinegar or wine to adjust its flow. Scribes favored reed pens, endlessly resharpened, alongside rulers, compasses, and oil lamps fueled by local olives. The copy rooms were kept as clean as Alexandria allowed. And soon, abundance brought a new challenge: finding anything at all. The solution was an invention equal to the library itself. Callimachus of Cyrene began compiling the Pinarches, tables that organized the collection by author, genre, and subject. They recorded opening lines, biographical notes, and judgments of authenticity. The Pinarches became a map of human writing, a literature about literature. With them, scholars could navigate the maze of knowledge with clarity and speed. The librarians themselves became figures of state. Zenodotus of Ephesus produced the first critical editions of Homer, comparing divergent manuscripts line by line, marking doubtful verses with meticulous care. Eratosthenes later brought mathematical order to geography and chronology. Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothrace refined textual criticism until Alexandrian became synonymous with scholarly precision. Under Philadelphus, translation became a political art. The most famous project was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, later known as the Septuagint. Whether legend or lesson, the story of 70 scholars translating in harmony captured Alexandria's ideal, traditions preserved by being made understandable to others. The crown's hunger for texts bordered on predation. One famous tale recounts how Athens' official copies of the great tragedians were borrowed for a vast deposit, a deposit Alexandria chose to forfeit in exchange for keeping the originals. Agents pursued Aristotle's lost library through generations of heirs. Booksellers learned that when a noble library came up for sale, Egypt would pay the highest price. Rival cities responded. Pergamon built its own great library, and legends claim that parchment rose there when papyrus supplies tightened. Competition breeds stories as surely as it breeds innovation. Alexandria itself expanded its vision. Beyond the royal quarter, the Serapeum rose, a temple blending Greek and Egyptian devotion, housing classrooms and a secondary library. Here, philosophy was taught among incense and stone, affirming a simple truth: sacred knowledge and secular knowledge were not enemies. Both gave coherence to the city. Life in the Mausian followed a gentle rhythm. New arrivals learned the standardized script of the copy rooms and the citation methods that allowed ideas to be traced to their sources. Mornings were devoted to lectures in grammar and logic. Afternoons passed in research, copying, and quiet collation. Meals were shared at long tables, a detail that mattered more than it seems, for conversation, like food, nourished the work of the mind. And so, beneath fig trees and colonnades, beside ink-stained desks and star-watching rooms, Alexandria pursued a dream both fragile and immense: that human knowledge, once gathered and cared for, might outlast empires themselves. Conversation at the communal tables often became the hidden engine of discovery. A casual remark shared over bread and wine could turn a half-formed intuition into a serious project, or transform a rumor carried from afar into a disciplined line of inquiry. Travelers arriving from Rhodes, Syracuse, or Cyrene brought with them news of new techniques, unfamiliar instruments, and unexpected results. Knowledge arrived not only in scrolls, but in voices. When a royal patron entered the refectory, the scholars stood. The Ptolemies ensured that gratitude was never abstract. The candles that illuminated the pages after sunset, the papyrus beneath the ink, the food that sustained long arguments, all were gifts of the crown. To watch the library at work was to understand that the Ptolemies were not merely ruling a present population. They were attempting to govern the future. In a land where papyrus decays and insects remain indifferent to human ambition, preservation could only be achieved through multiplication. The scribes of Alexandria copied texts on a scale unseen before. And because of this excess, when later fires burned and wars swept through cities, the words themselves survived elsewhere. Copies lived on in other ports, other schools, other libraries. The dream of holding everything in one place was impossible even then. Yet by sending sponsored copies to allies and friendly academies, Alexandria created something more resilient than a single archive, a distributed network of knowledge. The idea of a universal library became, in practice, a method for seeding the world with texts. Ancient numbers are often generous, but even cautious historians agree that the collection reached into the hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The exact figure matters less than the pattern. With every shipment inspected, every private library acquired, the shelves became a survey of human thought. Works from Egypt, Ionia, Sicily, mainland Greece, and distant lands sat side by side. There were treatises on nature, mathematical proofs, dramas and histories, travel accounts written by men who followed caravans across Syria or sailed the Red Sea. Alexandria did not merely copy texts. It compared them, corrected them, annotated them, and organized them. It transformed writing into usable knowledge. And in that act lay the deepest reason the Mausian mattered. The Ptolemies had taken a sandbank and a fishing village and turned it into a city capable of training navigators, doctors, engineers, poets, and administrators, minds suited for an empire shaped by river and sea. They created a stage where every subject could be debated, tested, and refined. The Muses were not sentimental patrons. They were the names of disciplines. To gather them under one roof was to declare that a state could be powerful because it was learned. At its height, the Mausian was not a quiet sanctuary, but a living engine of ideas. The porters hauling baskets of papyrus from the docks belonged to the same organism as the mathematician tracing a proof beneath a colonnade, and the physician sharpening a bronze scalpel for a difficult anatomical lesson. Knowledge was treated as a craft, something that required tools, time, and community. Mathematics set the rhythm. Euclid taught in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I, and perhaps into the reign of his son. His Elements was already revered in his lifetime. It did not invent geometry, it disciplined it. Beginning with definitions and axioms, it climbed step by step toward theorems that could withstand any honest challenge. Students trained in Euclid's method learned to think clearly, to state assumptions openly, and to accept rigor as a form of intellectual economy. In the same generation, Apollonius of Perga wrote his conics in Alexandria, leaving behind a vocabulary engineers still use without reflection: ellipse, parabola, hyperbola. These were not decorative abstractions. They described the natural paths of orbits, trajectories, and mirrors. In a city that guided fleets by lighthouse and star, the geometry of focus and reflection was a practical art. Eratosthenes of Cyrene embodied the Alexandrian ideal at full strength. Librarian, geographer, chronologist, and poet, he measured the size of the earth with an elegance that still astonishes. Knowing that at sea the midday sun at the summer solstice cast no shadow, while in Alexandria it did, he measured the angle, just over 7 degrees, and multiplied the distance between the cities accordingly. His result came within a few percent of the true circumference. He also drew a world map marked with parallels and meridians, and devised a method for identifying prime numbers that still bears his name. Astronomy flourished in Alexandria, even when its boldest ideas were not universally accepted. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun and that the stars lay at immense distances. The theory did not prevail, but its very articulation reveals the intellectual climate of the city. Conon of Samos worked in Alexandria and corresponded with Archimedes of Syracuse. Their exchanges gave rise to the Archimedean spiral and eclipse calendars vital to both astronomy and ritual timekeeping. Hipparchus, working later, compared Alexandrian observations with Babylonian records and discovered the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of the Earth perceptible only through generations of patient measurement. Natural philosophy here took material form. Ctesibius, the son of a barber, designed machines that made air and water obedient. He improved water clocks, invented piston pumps, and wrote on pneumatics. A century later, Hero of Alexandria compiled mechanical knowledge into manuals describing self-opening temple doors, automated theatrical displays, and a spinning steam-powered sphere. These were demonstrations and amusements, but they also trained craftsmen to think in terms of valves, pressure, siphons, and feedback. Medicine in Alexandria ventured further than anywhere before. Herophilus and Erasistratus dissected human bodies and described what they saw with unprecedented precision. Herophilus distinguished sensory from motor nerves and traced many to the spinal cord. He named the duodenum, described the brain's ventricles, and studied the pulse as a diagnostic rhythm. Erasistratus described heart valves and argued that the heart functioned as a pump, not merely a source of heat. He placed the seat of the mind in the brain. Language itself became a science. Zenodotus, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus of Samothrace confronted shelves full of variant texts and developed critical symbols to judge authenticity. They marked doubtful lines, identified duplications, and shaped Homer into a form that would endure for millennia. Their student, Dionysius Thrax, wrote the first surviving grammar of Greek, dividing language into parts of speech and providing a model that spread across the Mediterranean. History and ethnography were cultivated as well. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, organized the long succession of pharaohs into dynasties. Timosthenes, an admiral and geographer, wrote reliable coastal guides for sailors. Others collected proverbs, catalogued athletic victors, and assembled chronologies of festivals and theaters. And so, beneath lamps and columns, amid argument and silence, Alexandria worked patiently. Not to freeze knowledge in place, but to refine it, multiply it, and send it outward, trusting that what was shared would endure longer than any single city ever could. The habit of making lists was never a small or mechanical task. In a world without printing, without indexes, without search, a list was a map. It was a way to move safely through an ocean of handwritten scrolls, each one fragile, each one unique. To catalog knowledge was to give it shape. Without lists, learning dissolved into noise. In Alexandria, scholarship did not smother creativity. It sharpened it. Poetry flourished in the shadow of the librarians. Callimachus wrote epigrams that shimmered with learned wit and argued, sometimes sharply, that length alone did not make a poem great. Precision mattered. Density mattered. Theocritus shaped the pastoral world into something quietly radical, countryside imagined through the eyes of a city, nature filtered by urban intelligence. Apollonius of Rhodes composed the Argonautica, an epic that carried heroic adventure forward while weaving in scholarship, geography, genealogy, and courtly expectation. These poets did not work apart from criticism. They dined with librarians. They argued with editors. Creation and correction shared the same tables. Even their disputes became part of the city's inheritance. Callimachus and Apollonius exchanged pointed lines about what kind of poetry deserved a crown. In Alexandria, literary quarrels were not distractions. They were fuel. Translation work widened the boundaries of civilization itself. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, later known as the Septuagint, reshaped the Mediterranean intellectual world. It allowed Jewish communities across Greek-speaking cities to read sacred history in the language of commerce, philosophy, and law. It opened Hebrew poetry and ethics to Greek readers. And in centuries to come, it would supply early Christian writers with a vocabulary that shaped theology, art, and imagination. Other translation efforts flowed in different directions. Egyptian medical and ritual texts entered Greek collections. Mathematical and astronomical works with roots in Mesopotamia were edited, commented upon, and returned to circulation bearing Alexandrian names. Knowledge moved not as conquest, but as transformation. The administration that supported this work thought beyond prestige. Accurate calendars were needed to coordinate taxation and ritual. Reliable star tables guided convoys across open water. Skilled clerks kept accounts in an empire sustained by grain. The Mausian repaid this investment with applied knowledge. Surveyors trained in Euclidean geometry laid out canals and fields after the flood. Shipwrights shaped hulls according to curves that Archimedes himself would have recognized. Physicians educated in Alexandrian medicine reduced mortality among soldiers and dockworkers alike. The lighthouse was not the only device keeping Alexandria alive. Famous visitors amplified the city's reputation. Archimedes spent time in Alexandria and maintained long correspondence with scholars there. His works on floating bodies, geometry, and playful numerical problems traveled as packets of papyrus up and down the Nile and across the Aegean. Strabo arrived later and still found the Mausian active, even as royal patronage began to thin. Travelers carried home a powerful idea, that curiosity could be centralized, and that doing so could strengthen a state. The librarians also invented professional habits that endure to this day. They cited sources. They dated events across multiple chronologies and explained how contradictions were resolved. They kept working bibliographies and revised them when better copies appeared. They recorded the opening lines of scrolls so texts could be identified even if titles were lost. They taught students to question smooth narratives and ask how a manuscript reached the table at all. In doing so, they turned criticism into a civic virtue. It is easy to romanticize a great library. The Alexandrians themselves did not. They were practical, exacting, and proud. They valued order. They valued argument. They believed words could be improved and numbers could describe reality more faithfully than myth alone. Their city gave them a stage to prove it. What they built was more than a collection. It was a method, a way of thinking about evidence and proof that survived even when buildings fell and scrolls returned to dust. Morning in Alexandria began with the rattle of carts along the Canopic Way and the slow swing of harbor cranes over water pail with reflected light. In the royal quarter, marble stayed cool a little longer beneath porticos and fig trees and tall plane trees that loved the damp air drifting from Lake Merotis. Within this ordered calm, the Mausian awoke like a monastery devoted not to prayer, but to inquiry. Servants trimmed lamp wicks in the copy rooms and refilled inkwells with practiced care. A steward checked the water clock that governed lectures and debates. When the bronze bell sounded, its tone carried through cloisters and gardens. Scholars in light linen mantles emerged from their quarters and gathered for bread, olives, and the first conversations of the day. The talk was practical. Which scrolls were expected from the customs house? Which reading of a corrupt line in Aeschylus now seemed most convincing? Which plant in the botanical garden had adapted best to brackish soil? News traveled with the food. The Mausian was not a single hall of books, but a living compound. Walkways linked dining rooms to lecture courts, copy chambers to an observatory where lines were etched into stone for tracking the stars. Gardens served study as much as beauty. Physicians cultivated medicinal plants. Natural philosophers set out basins to observe the breeding of eels when the Nile rose. An enclosure held gazelles, ibises, and a few imported monkeys, a modest menagerie for comparing bone and muscle across species. A path climbed toward the Serapeum, where the daughter library formed a second hive of study and offered sweeping views of rooftops and harbor. Work began with arrival. Royal policy made librarians partners of harbor officials. When a ship docked, its cargo was inspected not only for copper, wine, or grain. Any book on board was recorded, taken to the copy rooms, and returned as a finely written duplicate on clean papyrus. The original remained in Alexandria. Owners protested, then relented when they saw the quality of the copy. The city paid for the labor from a royal fund that also supported stipends, repairs, and the maintenance of the catalogue. In this way, global trade became fuel for scholarship. Inside the copy rooms, the air carried a faint scent of resin and oil. Tables were built at a height that spared the back. Papyrus sheets were joined edge to edge into long rolls and wrapped around wooden cores. A trained reader recited the text aloud while 2 or 3 scribes wrote simultaneously, each on his own scroll. When a word was uncertain, they paused, consulted another exemplar, and marked variants. Accents and breathing marks guided future readers where the ear might mislead the eye. At the end of a roll, the scribe added a subscription, title, author, and line count, a safeguard against omission. Chalk dust fixed the ink. Linen cord secured the roll. A label hung from the edge so the title could be read at a glance on the shelf. Order followed copying. Callimachus' great catalogue, the Pinakes, guided shelving and retrieval. Assistants learned its structure as one learns a city map: poetry, drama, history, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography. Within each category, authors were listed, works identified by opening lines, biographies summarized, reputations weighed. A scholar requesting a book approached the desk of the bibliophilax, the guardian of the rolls. Runners moved along colonnades to fetch texts. If a subject was requested instead, selections were made, often including variant copies, so comparison could begin immediately. The system turned a maze into streets. Meals at common tables doubled as offices. A physician might dine with a grammarian and an astronomer and solve a problem by conversation alone. A doctor seeking a precise word for a bone might learn it from a man who edited Homer. In Alexandria, knowledge moved not in isolation, but in shared air, spoken, argued, corrected, and quietly refined, one day at a time. An astronomer who found himself wondering whether vapors rising from the marshes could bend light along the horizon did not keep the question to himself. He might walk across a shaded court and ask a physician what fevers did to vision, how heat altered perception, whether the eye itself could be deceived by the body's imbalance. In Alexandria, curiosity moved sideways as often as it moved forward. Questions crossed disciplines before they settled into answers. The head of the Mausian presided with the calm authority of a priest. His role was not to dominate debate, but to keep it fertile. He settled disputes before they hardened, decided when a project justified drawing resources from the royal treasury, and reminded scholars that the community existed to serve inquiry rather than ego. Conversation was constant, but rarely rude. Respect was shown through habit rather than silence. When a royal patron entered, scholars rose as one. When a visiting savant arrived from Rhodes or Anch, a place of honor was offered, and a student delivered a brief encomium, acknowledging both the guest's work and the city's gratitude. Late morning belonged to instruction. In the grammar court, a master unrolled Homer and treated the poem as a living creature, one that required careful dissection rather than blind admiration. He paused at a line where an epithet differed between copies, explained the dialect behind each form, and gave reasons for preferring one reading over another. Nearby, a geometer stretched a rope across sand, fixed pegs at measured points, and walked his students through a proof that began with touch before it reached abstraction. In another court, a physician presented a model of the human heart carved from wax and wood, tracing the direction of flow while a boy turned a small piston pump to imitate the rhythm of the pulse. Under an arbor, a philosopher led students through a dialogue of Plato, then asked whether the argument survived contact with the courts and markets of Alexandria itself. The methods differed. The belief was shared. Knowledge had to be examined in public. Afternoons settled into quieter labor. Scholars worked at stands with scrolls supported by wooden rests, narrow knives close at hand to lift fibers and examine layers of papyrus. Continuous script demanded a trained eye and a memory disciplined enough to hear word boundaries where none were written. Editors marked faint dots or hooks where divisions seemed plausible and left disagreements to bloom in the margins. When two exemplars diverged, both readings were recorded, accompanied by a brief note explaining which appeared older and why. Aristarchus and his successors refined a system of signs for this work. A small arbalist marked a line suspected of later insertion. A diplo drew attention to a passage requiring care. These were not decorations. They were the beginnings of an ethics of citation, a quiet promise to future readers that uncertainty had been acknowledged rather than concealed. The Mausian had its rituals, and it had its quarrels. Poets debated the worth of brief forms against long epics. Mathematicians argued over method, whether diagrams must be drawn to scale, whether a proof could admit argument from measurement or must remain purely deductive. Physicians divided between those who trusted anatomical observation and those who leaned on the humoral balance inherited from earlier authorities. When the rules held, these disputes sharpened thought. When politics intruded, they could spill into the city beyond the walls. The head of the community could suspend a stipend if decorum failed. On rare occasions, the king banished a man whose words threatened order. Most of the time, the gravity of shared work kept tempers in their courses. The Serapeum gave scholarly life another rhythm. Its steps rose high above the streets, and the precinct within followed its own order. Priests tended the cult of Serapes with incense and measured music. In adjoining halls, students read Aristotle and Zeno, learning to argue before they learned to govern. The daughter library stored its rolls in cedar-lined cases to discourage pests. During the hottest months, doors opened early and closed at noon to preserve the cool. Evenings brought readers back for one last hour of light before lamps were lit. The mingling of temple and library created an atmosphere both sacred and practical. Cedar, oil, and papyrus blended into a scent visitors carried with them for life. Much of daily work was unglamorous. Insects loved glue and starch. Mold thrived on sea air. Librarians rotated roles so none lingered too long in damp corners. Cedar oil brushed onto shelves deterred pests. Frayed edges were repaired with fresh papyrus. A typical roll contained 20 sheets and required 2 hands to manage comfortably. Longer works were divided into books and numbered so readers knew which portion they held. When a roll wore thin from use, a new copy was ordered if the text mattered. Inferior copies were retired to back storerooms, never discarded without record. The catalogue noted each change and the reasons behind it. Evenings returned the institution to the city. Public recitals drew citizens into the precinct. A poet sang a new idyll and answered questions about a line that alluded to the band festival. A historian read from an account of a voyage to Cyrene and displayed a small map painted in colored inks. A physician described diseases observed during the flood season and proposed a schedule for future clinics. The Mausian was not a cloister. It was the thinking mind of Alexandria speaking aloud to the streets that sustained it. The presence of the crown was constant, but rarely loud. The priest of the Mausian kept a register of residence for the palace steward who managed stipends. Payments arrived as coin or grain at fixed intervals. Larger grants funded special projects. A new edition of Homer brought funds for additional exemplars. Astronomers received bronze for an armillary sphere from royal stores. When physicians proposed an anatomical theater designed to cool and screen bodies, masons arrived with plans already drawn. The Ptolemies were patrons, not democrats. They expected gratitude, dedications in books, demonstrations of machines that obeyed commands, and they received it. The city beyond the walls shaped the curriculum. Alexandria was the counting house of the Mediterranean. Arithmetic was taught with counters and boards, using problems drawn from docks and warehouses. Students learned to calculate grain volumes in irregular spaces, estimate losses at sea, and evaluate claims made by shipowners. They learned to test coinage by weight and alloy. Mathematics became a civic tool. Foreign voices gave the Mausian its cosmopolitan tone. Jewish scholars translated scripture, reading their Greek aloud to ensure poetry survived the crossing between languages. Egyptian priests brought ritual texts, calendars, and hymns to be copied with the same care as Greek drama. Merchants and sailors supplied lists of winds and harbors, sometimes offering journals kept by literate captains. Editors absorbed it all. The library became not merely a storehouse of Greek letters, but a prism through which many traditions were made intelligible. There were moments of theater. A major acquisition could halt the day. Bundles of scrolls arrived sealed in wax, the private library of a renowned philosopher. The head librarian broke a seal and read the opening lines. A hush fell, then a low murmur as titles were recognized. Tables were cleared. Catalogers prepared their tablets. The plan of the day shifted, and the community turned together, like a school of fish responding to a shadow passing overhead. And there were quiet moments that revealed the spirit of the place. A young scholar returned a scroll of Thucydides and apologized for a smear caused by a guttering lamp. The guardian smiled, waved the apology aside, and showed him how to place a small glass bowl behind the wick to catch soot and soften the smoke. Knowledge here was not only preserved in texts, but passed hand to hand, patiently, in the small kindnesses of practice. In Alexandria, knowledge was never solitary. A question rarely ended where it began. A mind that followed an idea far enough would eventually arrive at the edge of another scholar's table. An astronomer puzzling over the bending of light near the horizon might find himself speaking with a physician, asking how rising vapors and fevered eyes altered perception. The physician, in answering, would unknowingly supply material for optics. This was not coincidence. It was design. The Mausian cultivated proximity, not specialization in isolation. That proximity was maintained by order. The head of the Mausian, part priest, part administrator, kept debate from becoming disorder, and decided when a project merited the treasury's resources. Conversation was constant, but never careless. Respect was shown through habit rather than silence. When a royal patron entered, scholars stood. When a visiting savant from Rhodes or Anch joined the midday meal, a place of honor was offered, and a student read a brief encomium composed for the occasion. Knowledge here was not ceremonial, but it was always taken seriously. Mornings belonged to instruction. In the grammar court, a master unrolled Homer and treated the poem as a living body, to be examined rather than admired. He pointed to a line where an epithet differed between copies, explained the dialect behind the variation, and gave reasons for preferring one reading over another. Elsewhere, a geometer stretched ropes between pegs, marking a proof in sand before redrawing it in charcoal on a board. A physician displayed a model of the human heart, carved from wax and wood, explaining the direction of flow, while a boy turned a small piston pump to mimic the pulse. Under an arbor, a philosopher led students through a Platonic dialogue and then asked whether the argument survived contact with the courts and customs of Alexandria. The methods varied. The conviction did not. Knowledge had to endure public examination. Afternoons settled into quiet labor. Scholars worked with scrolls set on stands, narrow knives in hand to lift fibers and inspect layers. Continuous script demanded a trained eye and a memory shaped by language rather than spacing. Editors placed faint dots or hooks where divisions seemed plausible, leaving contested readings for the margins. When two exemplars disagreed, both were recorded, along with a brief note explaining which seemed older and why. Small signs accumulated, marks that later generations would inherit as the ethics of citation. They were not decoration. They were discipline. The Mausian knew its quarrels. Poets argued over the worth of brief forms against long compositions. Mathematicians disputed whether a proof could rely on measurement or must remain purely deductive. Physicians divided between those who trusted anatomy and those who placed faith in humoral balance inherited from the ancients. As long as the rules held, these disputes were impersonal. When politics intruded, the city beyond the walls sometimes turned violent. Within the precinct, order was enforced. A stipend could be suspended. On rare occasions, a scholar whose words were deemed dangerous was exiled. More often, shared labor kept tempers within their courses. The Serapeum offered another rhythm. Its steps rose above the streets, and within its precinct sacred ritual coexisted with study. Incense and music honored Serapes, while adjoining halls held readings of Aristotle and Zeno. The daughter library stored its rolls in cedar-lined cases that discouraged insects. During the hottest months, doors opened early and closed at noon to preserve the cool. In the evenings, readers returned, using the last light before lamps were lit. The combination of temple and library created an atmosphere both solemn and practical, a scent of cedar, oil, and papyrus that visitors remembered for life. Preservation was an unglamorous but essential task. Insects favored glue and starch. Mold favored sea air. Librarians rotated rolls, brushed shelves with cedar oil, repaired frayed edges, and divided long works into numbered books. Nothing was discarded without record. The catalogue noted each change and its reason. Inferior copies were retired to storerooms when better exemplars arrived. Order was a daily labor. Evenings belonged to the city. Public recitations drew citizens into the precinct. A poet sang a new idyll and answered questions about a veiled illusion. A historian read from an account of a voyage and displayed a small map in colored inks. A physician described patterns of disease observed during the Nile flood and proposed schedules for future clinics. The Mausian was not a cloister. It was the city thinking aloud. Royal presence was felt without constant intrusion. A priest kept a register of residence for the palace steward who distributed stipends in coin or grain. Larger grants funded new editions of Homer or the casting of bronze instruments for astronomers. Anatomical theatres were built when physicians persuaded the court of their necessity. The Ptolemies were patrons, not democrats. They expected gratitude in visible forms, dedications, demonstrations, working machines. As court politics darkened, the balance faltered. Stipends thinned, vanished, or arrived late. Scholars learned how quickly favor could turn. Aristarchus of Samothrace resigned and fled, dying soon after in exile. Others followed, carrying Alexandrian methods to Rhodes, Pergamon, and Antsch. Knowledge traveled with people. The center cooled. At night, when harbor lamps flickered and the lighthouse beams slid across the haze, a reader might pause over a line of Herodotus. The water clock murmured softly. Salt and pitch drifted in with the wind. Somewhere beyond the breakwater, a ship rocked gently, and a sailor told a story that would reach a copyist's table before the season ended. Alexandria breathed through its library, and the library breathed back into the city. The world, here, was something that could be read. Royal authority did not collapse all at once. It tried, instead, to mend itself. In the years after civil war, decrees were issued with the careful language of repair. The Great Amnesty proclaimed in 118 BCE named priests, soldiers, landholders, and debtors, offering pardons to those who had chosen the losing side and attempting to restore clarity to property claims and tax obligations. Categories were defined. Exceptions were enumerated. The state sought to recover what had once been its greatest asset, predictability. A city that could calculate tomorrow might persuade its scholars to return. A harvest that followed expectation might refill the treasuries that sustained the Mausian. Yet internal repair unfolded beneath external pressure. Egypt no longer existed in a Mediterranean of equals. Decades earlier, Antiochus IV of the Seleucid dynasty had invaded the country, only to be halted outside Alexandria by a Roman envoy who drew a circle in the sand and demanded an answer before the king stepped beyond it. The scene endured because it marked a change in the grammar of power. Rome had once negotiated. Now it commanded. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Alexandria understood that the geometry of the world had shifted. Roman creditors arrived with polite words that carried the force of obligation. Letters from the Senate outweighed promises made in temples. The Ptolemaic court learned that sovereignty could be eroded without a single battle. Even so, the institutions of learning did not fall silent. In these years of contraction, brilliance still appeared, though less effortlessly than before. Scholars continued to teach medicine, to refine mathematical proofs, to preserve astronomical observations whose value depended on patience across generations. The habit of exhaustive commentary deepened. The pride that once drew talent without invitation had faded, replaced by caution. Letters of recommendation still pointed toward Alexandria, but with an added warning. Go, they advised, but protect your papers, and be ready to leave. Within the city, the geography of learning adjusted. The Serapeum, long a secondary library and a school embedded in temple precincts, grew in importance. Perched above the streets, it offered a degree of insulation from palace turbulence. Its priests were adept at managing relationships, with the court, with foreign communities, with donors whose loyalties lay beyond Egypt. Students who found the royal quarter unsettled climbed the hill instead and read beneath cedar beams darkened by oil and incense. The coexistence of ritual and study lent the place a steadiness that the harbor winds could not easily disturb. The administration of the library itself reflected the temper of the age. The office of head librarian, once the culmination of a life devoted to philology, was sometimes awarded to courtiers whose chief qualification was loyalty. Names appeared in official lists that would once have belonged to editors or grammarians. The pattern was uneven. True scholars still held authority at times, but it was visible enough to shape expectations. Alexandria, which had invented professional standards for textual work, now compromised them within its own walls. Students absorbed a second lesson alongside grammar and geometry. Excellence requires not only talent and training, but protection from fashion, from fear, from politics. Material consequences followed. When stipends shrank, copying slowed. When stewards left for better paid work, inspections of shelves grew infrequent. Cedar oil became costly in poor harvest years, and insects paid no attention to budgets. Librarians responded as they always had, by triage. Authors deemed essential were recopied. Lesser works waited. The catalogue retained its logic, but the lived map of the collection grew uneven, with some cupboards filling while others thinned. Preservation became an act of judgment rather than abundance. The wider city echoed this condition. In the Greek Quarter, great houses still hosted dinners where poets read new verses and inventors demonstrated clever mechanisms. Workshops along the edges of rakotes continued to mend nets and hammer copper. The long causeway to Pharos still carried carts and crowds. Yet calculation entered daily life. Merchants watched the sea with new attentiveness. Schoolmasters counted pupils more carefully. The unspoken question appeared in faces: how long will the money last? The answer lay beyond any single institution, in the Nile's floods, in Roman patience, in the temper of kings, and in the willingness of citizens to maintain faith in a civic experiment that had once made Alexandria admired across the Mediterranean. Exile scattered more than people. It dispersed habits. The editorial signs devised in the library traveled with the scholars who used them. The practice of prefacing books with short lives of authors spread to other cities. Catalogues became a recognized genre. Methods outlived buildings. It is an irony worth holding on to. The greatest legacy of a library may not be the shelves it keeps, but the way it teaches readers to handle texts. Visitors still arrived. A young man from Athens carried a roll of Menander he claimed had never been copied. A merchant from Tyre traded a Babylonian tablet he could not read for a warehouse lease. A Jewish scholar newly arrived from the south came to see the Greek scriptures he had heard of since childhood. The library received them all. Provenance was recorded when possible. Items were placed where they belonged. Even with diminished means, the institution honored its founding idea: the world comes to a great city, and a great city keeps the world. After the purge, the Mausian remained a school, a refuge, a symbol. It was no longer the uncontested center of the Republic of Letters. That republic now had many capitals and many roads. Scholars who had once argued in Alexandrian courtyards now wrote from islands, hill towns, and river cities. They carried Alexandria with them, in their hands, in their habits of mind. They taught students to compare copies, to weigh a line, to observe, to count, to doubt, and to value clarity. In that sense, exile transformed fear into influence. The first great wound remembered by posterity did not begin in a reading room. It began at the harbor. In the autumn of 48 BC, Julius Caesar entered Alexandria with a small force, drawn into the dynastic struggle between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. Egypt was a client kingdom, and its debts to Rome were real. Caesar arrived to arbitrate and to collect. He found a court already in motion. Advisors to the young king had secured the loyalty of the garrison and much of the city. Cleopatra waited beyond the walls, searching for a way back. The famous meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra belongs as much to theater as to history. What mattered more was the siege that followed. Outnumbered, Caesar secured the palace district and the harbor basins, placing troops on Pharos to control the eastern port. Alexandria's elegant grid, designed generations earlier, became a battlefield. Facing the Egyptian fleet at anchor and the shipyards that could replenish it, Caesar made a brutal calculation. He ordered the ships along the quays burned to deny them to the enemy. Fire does not respect intention. In a city of timber roofs and oil-soaked warehouses, sparks became messengers. Wind carried them into storehouses and down streets leading toward the royal quarter. Ancient writers later walked those lanes and tried to imagine what vanished in the hours when tar boiled on the water and flames climbed into the night. What was lost could not be fully counted. What endured would be argued for centuries. The figures that reach us do not arrive as certainties. They survive as echoes. Seneca, quoting an earlier historian, spoke of 40,000 scrolls lost when fire leapt from the ships to the warehouses along the harbor. Plutarch, writing with the restraint of a moralist, said only that the great library was burned. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria a generation later, offered no numbers at all. Instead, he noted something quieter and more troubling. Certain records once used by mathematicians of the old school could no longer be consulted. The absence itself had become evidence. Modern minds search instinctively for a plan. They ask which buildings burned. Were the main halls of the Mausoleum touched by flame, or was the destruction confined to outer depots, customs houses, dockside storerooms, places where duplicate copies and seized cargo were kept? The ancient sources do not resolve the question. What they agree on is the nature of the event. A fire, begun as a military tactic, exceeded intention. It destroyed thousands of texts that could not be replaced. The harbor quarter was designed for trade, not for containment. Rope, sailcloth, resin, oil, and timber crowded the quays and lofts. Streets ran narrow and continuous, built to move goods quickly rather than to stop flame. The rooms where scrolls were kept were cool and dark, ideal for preservation in ordinary times, and fatally vulnerable once a spark found its way inside. Papyrus burns with the eagerness of dried grass. Bucket lines were formed from the basins. Walls were pulled down where demolition might slow the advance. The palace district was saved. The cost was paid in books. Those who later wrote of the fire adopted a tone usually reserved for earthquakes or collapsed aqueducts, events born from the meeting of power and chance. The siege itself was no less desperate. Caesar fought to hold the lighthouse and the long causeway that linked it to the city, knowing that control of the sea meant survival. Street fighting flared along the Heptastadium. In his own account, Caesar tells of a moment when a sudden surge forced him from a bridge of boats and into the water, swimming for his life while clutching papers above the waves. Reinforcements under Mithridates of Pergamum eventually advanced down the Nile and broke the stalemate. In the confusion, Ptolemy XIII drowned when an overloaded boat capsized in the river. The war ended as dynastic wars often do, with exhaustion, executions, and a rearranged throne. Caesar installed Cleopatra as queen, paired formally with her younger brother, and remained long enough to restore order and to begin a relationship that would echo through poetry and rumor for 2 millennia. While the palace resumed its rhythms, smoke still lingered over the harbor quarter. The library had not vanished, but it had been struck. The strongest evidence for its survival lies not in claims, but in continuity. Within a generation, Strabo described the Mausoleum as an institution still alive, still dining in common, still governed by a priestly head, still devoted to study. He did not write as one composing an epitaph. Another tradition, often repeated, belongs to the same moment of recovery. Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and later Cleopatra's partner, is said to have presented Alexandria with the Library of Pergamum as a royal gift, 200,000 volumes, according to the story. Whether the number is accurate, or the gesture unfolded exactly as described, matters less than what the tale reveals. Contemporaries believed that rulers sought to refill the shelves. They wanted the world to know that Alexandria had repaired not only its docks and walls, but its reputation as the guardian of texts. That belief was not unfounded. Scholarly life continued. Didymus, later nicknamed Bronze Guts for his relentless productivity, produced an astonishing volume of commentaries in the late 1st century BCE and the early years of the next. Such work requires access to books and a culture of argument. Grammarians still taught. Physicians still lectured and demonstrated. Astronomers and geographers still compared records gathered across generations. The Serapeum, long a secondary center, grew in importance as a place of study somewhat removed from the palace. Alexandria recovered by shifting its balance rather than by pretending nothing had changed. Cleopatra understood that learning was a currency. In a Mediterranean ruled by legions, culture could still negotiate where armies could not. She patronized scholars, hosted banquets where poetry and mechanical marvels reminded visitors that this was still a city worthy of legend. The court funded new copies of classical works and granted privileges to those who could rebuild catalogues and train students. Writers in her circle produced treatises on plants, perfumes, cosmetics, poisons, and rare stones, a reminder that Alexandrian research had always joined curiosity to use. The market and the library were never strangers. Accurate measures, reliable recipes, and trustworthy knowledge served both. The memory of the fire never faded. Every later discussion of the library carried the question of loss. In a world without printing, a unique scroll was a single heartbeat. Once gone, it survived only by chance. Librarians of the early Roman period worked with that knowledge pressing on them. It sharpened their priorities. They focused on authors that defined education. They trained students in habits of collation and citation that would travel far beyond Egypt. They continued translation projects and the slow improvement of texts already in wide circulation. Preservation became deliberate rather than abundant. As the century turned, Rome's presence deepened. After the deaths of Caesar, Antony, and Cleopatra, Egypt became a province. The emperors grasped the city's importance immediately. Alexandria was not merely a jewel of culture, it was the hinge of an empire's food supply. The lighthouse was kept in repair. The Great Causeway was maintained as road, aqueduct, and defense. Harbors were dredged and guarded. Emperors also took an interest in the institutions that gave the city its character. Claudius sponsored editions and works. Learned Romans held honorary positions in the Mausian. The institution endured, though its nature slowly changed, from a royal academy of resident scholars to a broader community of teachers, officials, and literate professionals. Seen from this distance, the age of Caesar and Cleopatra stands as both rupture and proof. The fire was real. The losses were severe. So was the resilience. Alexandria refused to let catastrophe become an ending. It rebuilt with patronage, with scholarly energy, and with the magnetism of a city suspended between river and sea. The idea of a universal library returned, not as an untouched monument, but as a living practice. Copists sharpened reeds. Students argued over a single mark in the margin of Homer. The city remembered what it was. When Octavian became Augustus and Egypt passed formally into Roman hands, Alexandria awoke to a new arithmetic of power. No longer a dynastic capital, it became the keystone of an imperial system. Grain that began as silt and seed along the Nile ended as bread in Rome. The annual voyage of the grain fleet was not only an economic ritual, it was a political guarantee. Augustus placed Egypt under an equestrian prefect and barred senators without permission. The message was calm and absolute. Alexandria mattered too much to be left to ordinary politics. And within that constraint, the city continued to read the world. Rome did not govern Alexandria as a city among others. It governed it as an instrument, watched from the Palatine, measured by output, expected to function. And the city did function. The lighthouse on Pharos continued to burn through the nights. The Great Causeway served its double purpose as road and aqueduct. The twin harbor basins were kept deep enough for traffic, their channels dredged so grain ships could enter and leave on schedule. Canals linking lake to river were cleared and, where silting demanded it, cut again, allowing barges from the delta to arrive before seasonal winds shifted against them. Storehouses that had once belonged to kings were folded into the Annona, the logistical system that fed Rome itself. Alexandrian scribes, trained in habits older than the empire, kept parallel ledgers, recording volume, spoilage, moisture loss, and delay. Inspectors weighed coin, tested alloy, and verified payment to crews. Alexandria remained a city of numbers. Under Rome, the numbers only grew. Culture endured as well, though patronage no longer took the form of concentration. The Mausians still existed. Strabo, writing near the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, described it as an active institution, governed by a priestly head, inhabited by scholars who dined together and worked within its precincts. Yet membership slowly changed in character. Honorary places were granted to imperial officials and visiting dignitaries, men fluent in public life, if not always in texts. Where the Ptolemies had paid to gather mines in one place, Roman rule favored a wider, more civic literacy. Schools appeared near the Serapeum. Reading rooms belonged to guilds and to wealthy households. The Serapeum on its hill remained a daughter library and a school, sheltering philosophy and mathematics in a space that was both sacred and practical. Knowledge dispersed, but it did not thin. In the 2nd century, the city produced one of the most influential scientific minds in history. Claudius Ptolemy worked in Alexandria under Roman rule. His astronomical synthesis drew on centuries of observation, Greek geometry, and Babylonian calculation to present a coherent order of the heavens. He relied on tables preserved by earlier Alexandrian observers and extended them with his own long watching of the sky. He wrote on optics and geography, mapping the known world with coordinates that would shape thought for centuries. The name that once belonged to kings now belonged to a scholar. The shift itself measures the city's transformation. Political power had passed. Intellectual authority remained. Hero of Alexandria belongs to the same Roman centuries. He gathered and expanded the mechanical arts, describing siphons, valves, water organs, automated devices, and the steam-powered toy later ages would call the Aeolipile. His work testifies to a technical culture that survived the fall of dynasties. In medicine, instruction continued as well. Galen, writing a century later, spoke with respect of Egyptian anatomical traditions. Human dissection was no longer what it had been in the earliest Hellenistic years, but the habit of reasoned anatomy endured, through models, animal dissection, and debate over the seat of mind and the function of the heart. The book itself began to change. The papyrus roll still dominated, but the codex gained ground. Early Christian communities in Egypt favored the codex for scripture and teaching. Practical readers discovered its advantages, A place could be found instantly, margins welcomed annotation. Parchment did not replace papyrus in Alexandria during these early centuries, but mixed libraries emerged. Scribes learned new sewing patterns. Binders adapted adhesives and covers of wood or ivory, wrapped in tooled leather. Old workshops remained. New skills joined them. Imperial attention never fully drifted away. Claudius sponsored repairs and additions. Imperial names appeared on benefactions tied to public buildings and scholarly spaces. Members of Roman noble families held offices in the city and sometimes bore titles associated with the Mausian itself, a sign that the institution still conferred honor. Honor, however, could turn fragile when politics soured. In the year 38 of the Common Era, violence erupted. Long-standing tensions between segments of the Greek citizen body and Alexandria's large Jewish community flared into riots. Homes were looted. Synagogues were attacked. The prefect Flaccus mishandled the crisis so badly that Rome later arrested and executed him. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher steeped in Greek learning, left harrowing accounts of those days. His testimony reveals a city where scholarship and commerce flourished alongside resentments that demagogues could ignite and careless authority could inflame. Wider shocks followed. During the Kitos War under Trajan, unrest among Jewish communities across the eastern Mediterranean turned violent. Alexandria suffered heavily. Neighborhoods burned. Civic spaces required rebuilding. Later still, the Emperor Caracalla visited the city and, angered by satire and public mockery, ordered a massacre of young men and the confiscation of property. Taxes rose. Privileges shrank. These events mattered deeply for the fate of books. Cultural institutions do not float above their cities. When districts burn, the keepers of catalogues scatter. When treasuries tighten, stipends vanish. When fear governs, few ask after a corrupted line in a poem. The scholarly class changed with the times. Under the Ptolemies, the head librarian stood atop a pyramid of resident scholars. Under Rome, the title survived, but much of the work shifted outward. Teachers ran private schools. Administrators with literary training wrote manuals and commentaries. Wealthy families maintained household libraries and sponsored copying for friends and civic use. The idea of a single cabinet containing everything had never been literal. Under Rome, reality moved further toward a network, collections distributed across homes, schools, temples, and guild halls. Faith reshaped the landscape as well. The Serapeum continued to dominate the southwestern hill, both a monumental shrine and a gathering place for the last generations of pagan philosophers. The cult of Serapes had long symbolized cultural fusion. Meanwhile, Christian congregations grew in the streets below. Christian teachers still read Homer and Plato, but they also argued that a new canon was forming, one that required its own scribes, binders, and classrooms. Scripture in codex form moved through the city with a seriousness equal to anything once housed in the Mausian. The physical spaces of learning aged. Earthquakes are rarely mentioned, but salt air, subsidence, and neglect erode stone as effectively as fire. Roofs sag. Drains clog. Porticos lose columns. Roman funding favored commerce first and prestige second. A library wing might be built under one emperor and stripped for stone under another when funds ran short. Private benefactors filled some gaps. Inscriptions preserved their names. A ship owner endowed a reading room near the docks. A guild of papyrus makers paid to roof a walkway. Civic generosity kept spaces usable. Catalogues continued to exist, though the great pinakes of Callimachus were now memory rather than instrument. New lists served particular collections: the Caesareum, the Claudianum, the Serapeum. Visiting scholars carried working bibliographies of their own and compared them when they met. The method survived even as the central map blurred. That may be the most durable Alexandrian legacy. Knowledge here had learned how to live without a single heart. It could function as a practice, distributed across rooms, across institutions, across cities, long after the age of kings had passed. Fiscal policy left its mark on scholarship in ways that were easy to overlook and impossible to escape. In prosperous years, the prefect's office covered the upkeep of institutions, sometimes drawing on subsidies from Rome. In years of strain, taxes rose, coinage thinned, and long-standing privileges were quietly suspended. The 3rd century ushered in the drawn-out convulsion later called the Crisis of the Empire. Rival emperors marched, frontiers buckled, plague returned, and inflation gnawed at every province. In Egypt, the pressure was felt not in proclamations but in prices. Lamp oil for reading rooms cost more. Cedar oil for preserving shelves became harder to obtain. Fewer copyists could be paid. Guards once posted near scholarly precincts were reassigned to escort grain convoys to the docks. None of this announced itself as catastrophe. A water clock left unrepaired because the bronze smith had been commandeered to cast spearheads is not the stuff of chronicles. Yet such losses explain how a renowned campus can slowly fall quiet without ever being formally closed. The men whose names appear in inscriptions during the Roman period reflect this altered landscape. Tiberius Claudius Bulbillus, an astrologer of learning and a court insider, held honors associated with Alexandria's intellectual institutions. He was no Zenodotus or Aristarchus, no lifelong editor bent over variant lines, but a cultivated man of affairs. His presence signaled imperial favor rather than scholarly authority. Honorary appointments preserved the prestige of offices even as they loosened their standards. The city still housed excellent scholars, but the title no longer guaranteed that the finest textual mind in the Mediterranean stood at the helm. And yet learning endured. Grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and medicine continued to be taught. Students still memorized Homer and parsed sentences using manuals shaped by Alexandrian predecessors. Astronomers kept observing. Geographers recopied itineraries and sailing directions. Natural philosophers wrote on tides, winds, and the bending of light near the horizon. Travelers still came to marvel at the lighthouse and the long, straight sweep of the Canopic Way. Many also sought out the shaded precincts where scholars read beneath fig and plane trees. A visitor in the 2nd century would have found a learned city, less well-funded, less centralized than under the early Ptolemies, but still confident in its craft. As the 3rd century wore on, 2 long shadows stretched across Alexandria. One was military. Imperial attention was increasingly consumed by rebellions and border wars. The other was religious. Christian communities multiplied and their bishops spoke with growing authority. The tacit balance that had once linked temple, court, and school began to fray. These shadows would converge in the next act, when struggles for imperial control and battles over the city's religious soul brought fire into quarters once thought indestructible. The Roman centuries thus prepared the ground for the final crisis. They showed that Alexandria could adapt to new rulers, sustain scholarship without a royal court, and continue to contribute to science and letters. They also exposed the vulnerability of institutions dependent on steady revenue, civic calm, and shared pride. The Mausian became more ceremonial. The library became more dispersed. The Serapeum became increasingly central as a place of teaching. The city went on reading, arguing, and writing. But the framework that held these activities together groaned under strain. The end did not arrive in a single night. It came in waves, each eroding a little more of the civic memory until only fragments remained. The first great shock was military. In 270, the Emperor Aurelian marched against Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, whose forces had seized Egypt and with it Rome's grain supply. The fighting in Alexandria was ferocious. Ancient accounts report that Aurelian retook the city quarter by quarter and that the Brucheian, the royal district facing the harbors, long associated with the Mausian and palace libraries, was devastated. Fire followed steel. If any halls of the original royal library still stood in use, they were consumed in that storm. Later chroniclers used stark language. The district was laid waste. Another blow followed within a generation. In 297, during the revolt of Domitius Domitianus, Diocletian besieged Alexandria. He built siege works, cut canals, and starved the city into submission. When he entered in triumph, punishments followed that the sources describe as severe. Stone was stripped from public buildings to reinforce forts. Alexandria paid the familiar price of defeat in a civil war. Such campaigns rarely enumerate libraries among their casualties. Yet the pattern speaks plainly. When the quarter that once housed royal collections is burned and dismantled again and again, cupboards of papyrus do not endure. Scholarship did not vanish with those walls. Its center shifted to the southwestern hill where the Serapeum stood. The cult of Serapes, created by the first Ptolemy as a bridge between Greek and Egyptian traditions, had long symbolized the city itself. The precinct contained classrooms, porticos, and a daughter library that had always served as a second hive of study. In the late 3rd and 4th centuries, it became the primary home of secular teaching in Alexandria. Neoplatonic philosophers lectured there. Mathematicians trained students with diagrams and models. Compared to the unrest below, the hill carried a reputation for calm. But it could not remain untouched by the changing religious climate. Under emperors who favored Christianity, bishops in Alexandria gained immense influence. Imperial edicts ordered the closure of pagan temples. In 391, Patriarch Theophilus moved to eliminate the old cults. The Serapeum became the stage on which an age turned. Crowds entered the precinct, toppled the colossal statue of the god, and pulled down roofs and walls with ropes and levers. Eyewitnesses tell the story in different registers, but their accounts agree on the essentials: statues smashed, treasures looted, a sanctuary leveled. If rolls still rested in cedar cupboards, no patron remained to defend them. The precinct was cleared to its foundations. The hill lost the scent of incense and oil. It smelled instead of dust. The years that followed fixed Alexandria's direction. Christian schools expanded in the lower city. Bishops settled disputes and sponsored charitable institutions. Scholarship took on a theological inflection. Yet some teachers preserved the exacting habits of the older tradition. The most famous was Hypatia, mathematician and philosopher, teaching in the early 5th century. Her father Theon edited mathematical texts and commented on Ptolemy. She lectured on geometry, astronomy, and philosophy to students of standing, pagan and Christian alike. Her murder in 415 by a mob claiming religious zeal shocked the empire. Politically, it grew from factional strife between bishop and prefect. In memory, it attached itself to the story of the books. People said a way of thinking had been slain with her in the street. Later centuries brought new rulers and new legends. Arab armies entered Egypt in the 7th century and founded Fustat as their capital. A tale arose long afterward claiming that the conquerors burned an ancient library to heat bathhouses for months. No contemporary source records such an act. The story appears centuries later, when the royal quarter had vanished and the Serapeum had been empty for 200 years. Whatever survived of Alexandria's collections had already traveled outward in copies, to other cities, other languages, other traditions. The final blows to the great library belong, then, to Roman and late Roman times, to Aurelian in war, to Diocletian in siege, to Theophilus in a purge sanctioned by imperial law. Buildings fell. Shelves burned. Catalogues were broken apart and reused as scrap. Yet the Alexandrian method had already escaped its birthplace. Editors in Pergamum and Rhodes adopted its critical signs. Scribes in Antioch and Byzantine scriptoria practiced its habits. What Alexandria lost in walls, the world retained in technique. The city that once tried to gather all knowledge in one place ended by teaching others how knowledge could survive without one. Translators in Syria and in the academies of the early Islamic world handled Greek science that had once been gathered, compared, and corrected in Alexandria. Long after the city lost its shelves, it continued to teach the Mediterranean how texts survive, not by isolation, but by repetition, by commentary, by movement from hand to hand and language to language. That lesson endured even when the rooms where it was learned lay in ruins. A visitor climbing the southwestern hill in the 5th century would have found silence where the Serapeum once rose. A single towering column dominated the view, the monument later misnamed Pompey's Pillar, though it honored a Roman emperor of a later age. Wind crossed exposed foundations. From that height, one could still see the sea. The lighthouse continued to burn at night. Ships still crossed the harbor basins. The long causeway still carried carts and travelers between city and island. Yet the institutional heart that had once drawn scholars to dine together and argue beneath porticos was gone. Intellectual life had not ended. It had changed its addresses. As the physical library diminished, its afterlife grew. In memory, Alexandria became larger than it had ever been in stone. What had once been measured in shelves and catalogue entries turned into a parable, a story retold by successive ages to express their hopes and anxieties about knowledge itself. What burned was not only papyrus. A narrative burned its way into the shared inheritance of the Mediterranean and beyond. Each era chose a culprit that suited its lesson. Roman moralists preferred a single tragic spark, Julius Caesar's fires in the harbor, a commander who won a siege and accidentally loosened civilization's archive. Christian chroniclers of late antiquity, writing as temples fell and new scriptures rose, placed the final act at the Serapeum, where crowds obeyed imperial edicts and cleared a hill that had once joined worship and study. Centuries later, writers in Arabic and Syriac circulated a sterner tale. In it, conquerors asked a caliph whether to spare a hoard of ancient books. The answer came as a harsh syllogism. If the books agreed with scripture, they were unnecessary. If they disagreed, they were dangerous. The furnaces of bathhouses then glowed for months on the fuel of a dead age. The details of this story arrive late. They shift from teller to teller. The silence of 7th century witnesses weighs more than the rhetoric of the 13th. Modern historians follow provenance and date and find that the legend belongs to a season of polemic, not to the first decades after the conquest. And yet the tale persists because it satisfies a human hunger. Disaster feels complete when it can be traced to a single decision. Other legends are gentler. Mark Antony, in one famous story, gifts Cleopatra the Library of Pergamum, 200,000 rolls transferred as an act of love and statecraft, refilling what fire had taken. The image comforts because it imagines repair through devotion rather than loss through chance. It also flatters Alexandria by casting a rival's treasure as tribute. Whether the numbers are exact or the transaction literal matters less than what the story reveals. Contemporaries believed that the city which held the books held the future. Within the walls, other myths took shape. Callimachus's Pinarches, the vast bibliographic map of literature, became in later retellings a lost master key. One imagines tablets listing every play of Aeschylus, every book of Herodotus, every treatise of the mathematicians, complete with first lines, authenticity notes, and provenance. Anyone who has searched a library for a book that must exist understands why the Pinarches haunt the imagination. Their loss feels like the theft of a compass. Enough fragments survive to prove the scale and method of the work, not enough to restore it. The city also gathered stories of hidden rooms and sealed vaults. Late antique visitors described underground passages in the royal quarter and beneath the Serapeum, where priests and librarians were said to have concealed precious texts when soldiers approached. Modern archaeology in Alexandria is difficult. Water tables, later construction, and uninterrupted habitation interrupt the ground's testimony. Still, evidence of storage chambers and service corridors invites the hope that a roll might yet emerge from a wall where someone once hid it in fear. Finds elsewhere in Egypt keep that hope alive. The rubbish mounds of Oxyrhynchus, dry and kind to papyrus, have yielded poems of Sappho and plays of Menander long thought lost. The Nag Hammadi codices surfaced from jars in a farmer's field and revealed a library no catalogue had promised. If the desert could lift its veil for a village 200 miles from Alexandria, why not for a street along the Canopic Way? Careful minds insist on evidence. Legends endure all the same. Over time, the Lost Library assembled a cast of vanished works that feel almost like characters. Lists begin with the complete plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, with histories by Theopompus and Hecataeus, with treatises of the atomists, with the many books of Chrysippus, with maps and coastal guides that once led sailors by night along the Levant. Popular imagination fixes on a single great blaze and a shelf of irreplaceable masterpieces curling into ash. The sources tell a slower story, one of erosion across centuries. Ptolemaic accumulation was real and often aggressive. Roman repair alternated with Roman neglect, shaped by the politics of each reign. Aurelian soldiers tore down the Bruchian while reclaiming a city in revolt. Diocletian finished what ruin had begun when he starved Alexandria into submission and rebuilt walls from dismantled stone. The Serapeum endured as a school and daughter library until the age of Theodosius, when new religious policy brought the hammer down. There is no final inventory to compare against a fire report. There is attrition, a long wind rather than a single spark. Against this stands another narrative, one that treats the library less as a victim than as a seed. Alexandrian practice traveled. Grammar, cataloging, large-scale copying, and the use of critical signs moved with exiles and students to Pergamum, Rhodes, Ansh, and Rome. Greek learning passed into Syriac and then into Arabic during the translation movement of the early Abbasid age. Names associated with Baghdad's House of Wisdom mark stages in this relay. Hunayn ibn Shak translated Galen and Hippocrates. Thabit ibn Qurra edited and expanded works in mathematics and astronomy, writing in ways that readers trained on Euclid would recognize. Ptolemy's star tables, the Almagest by a later name, stood at the center of a science that stretched from river to river. Scholars in Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba read books that had once passed under Alexandrian eyes. When Renaissance Europe sought antiquity's voice, it often found it through these Arabic and Greek intermediaries. The city's Jewish story offers another thread. The Septuagint, translated in Alexandria, made Hebrew scripture speak the language of merchants and philosophers. Later generations transformed the event into miracle, 70 or 72 translators working separately yet producing identical texts. The legend expresses anxiety about fidelity and faith in providence. The reality reflects Alexandria's character. Translation: there was a public act. It made communities intelligible to one another and reshaped religion and literature. The presence of that Greek Bible in the ancient collection gave later readers reason to imagine other missing books, texts that might reconcile traditions if only they could be found again. Travelers writing of Alexandria in later centuries added romance to record. They lingered over the solitary column on the Serapeum hill and invited listeners to imagine the vanished halls around it. They spoke of curious machines in private houses, said to follow designs from ancient mechanical manuals. They praised teachers who called themselves Platonists and wore plain cloaks in a city that had once clothed scholars in priestly titles. In these portraits, the library becomes less a building than a way of seeing, a habit of measuring greatness by the number of voices a city can host. And so the legend turns, at last, from culprits and treasures to a moral. Knowledge is not a single place, however splendid. It is a practice that survives by being shared, argued over, copied imperfectly, and taught anew. Alexandria's shelves fell. Its method walked out into the world. In that sense, the library did not die. It dissolved into other cities, other languages, other centuries, until it could no longer be burned. It ultimately asks a simple but uncomfortable question: what responsibilities fall on a city or a state when it inherits knowledge rather than discovers it? Alexandria's story answers without hesitation. Support matters. Shelter matters. Wages, light, tolerance, and time matter. Indexers and catalogers matter as much as poets and visionaries. A quiet copyist bent over a clean table may be as decisive as any general, fighting not enemies, but disappearance. Myth prefers to compress this lesson into a single catastrophic choice, a spark that erased a world. History resists that drama. It shows instead a long procession of decisions, some generous, some careless, some openly hostile, that together produced the same silence. Legend moves us with images of flames racing across wooden shelves. History slows us down with ledgers, tax orders, siege logistics, sermons, cargo manifests, and workshops where ink dried up before ideas did. The library survives in both forms because both speak to different needs. The heart wants images. The mind demands causes. In the end, the most enduring story about Alexandria is not that it vanished, but that it never entirely left. It appears whenever a city funds a public school. It appears when a small archive places its catalog online and a reader, continents away, recognizes a forgotten sibling of a text she loves. It appears when a teacher explains that a careful note in the margin is a gift to someone not yet born. Alexandria became both a warning about loss and a manual for survival. That double role explains why its name still measures our ambitions. The ruins themselves are quiet. The method never stopped speaking. What began as royal sponsorship in a harbor city wedged between lake and sea became a model for how civilizations preserve their own memory. Alexandria taught later ages that knowledge is a public endeavor, that it requires money, space, rules, and patience, and that the strongest defense against loss is not protection, but multiplication. The first heirs stood closer than legend often admits. Long after the royal quarter fell, the Byzantine world maintained scriptoria where Greek texts were copied, glossed, and carefully compared. In Constantinople, monks preserved habits any Alexandrian librarian would recognize: lists of opening lines for identification, notes on provenance, distrust of elegant but unsupported claims, and a preference for named authorities. Grammar manuals descended from Dionysius Thrax shaped classrooms from Ansch to Trebizond. The imperial library did not claim universality, but its stewards safeguarded the skeletal framework of ancient science, medicine, and literature. When fires and sackings came, the work had already traveled outward. Farther east, along the Tigris, a second Alexandria took shape. Under Abbasid caliphs who understood that prestige and policy both favored scholarship, Baghdad became a city of books. Texts moved from Greek into Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic. Mathematics crossed languages and improved in transit. Hunayn ibn Ishaq organized teams that collated multiple versions of Galen, resolved contradictions, and produced translations that were both precise and readable. Thabit ibn Qurra and his circle refined number theory and astronomy. Ptolemy's star tables entered Arabic as a living tool, guiding observatories from Damascus to Samarkand. Geography gained new grids. The catalogue traveled as well. Bibliographers compiled lists by subject and alphabet, judging authenticity with a rigor that echoed Callimachus. What had been royal policy on the Nile matured into civic craft on the Tigris. To the west, monastic Europe preserved a different expression of the same idea. From Ireland to Italy, scribes worked through winters long enough to test any faith. The book changed form. Scrolls gave way to codices. Margins became arenas of debate, where readers argued across centuries. Carolingian ornament met scholastic discipline in pages designed to survive candlelight and early mornings. When universities rose in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they carried forward another Alexandrian conviction: a city grows stronger by making rooms where questions may be asked aloud. The chain bent again in Renaissance Italy. Merchants and humanists searched monasteries and civic cupboards for manuscripts that had slipped from use. Petrarch and his peers taught Europe to treat a manuscript not as a relic, but as a vessel returned from a long voyage. When the press arrived, first in Mainz, then Venice and Basel, the craft of comparison gained a new engine. Printers hired scholars to collate sources and mark decisions. The critical symbols of Alexandria found new cousins in the pointing hands and marginal notes of early printed books. Catalogues expanded from tablets to printed lists that allowed a scholar to request a title from another city and expect it to arrive. By then, Alexandria's intellectual DNA had become ordinary enough to fade into the background of public life. City councils funded schools. Donors built libraries and engraved their names above the doors. Librarians wrote rules for lending, silence, hours, bindings, and margins treated as shared space. Bibliography became a profession. Legal deposit ensured that a nation's memory no longer depended on luck. Classification systems gave numbers to shelves in ways Callimachus would have recognized instantly. Card catalogues, then digital ones, extended the pinakes into faster, but not fundamentally different, forms. The sciences carried the most exacting strand of this legacy. Astronomers recording new stars in China and Denmark wrote into a tradition that began when Eratosthenes measured the Earth with shadow and distance. Physicians preparing anatomy theaters inherited a culture that trusted observation. Mathematicians proved theorems with a voice trained by Euclid. Geographers mapped the world with grids that would later guide satellites. Wherever a footnote appears, wherever a claim demands a source, Alexandria inclines its head. Some legacies cannot be shelved. The library became a symbol intelligible even to those who never read Greek. It stands for the idea that a city's health includes its books. It speaks when a government funds a public library, when children walk beneath ceilings painted with names they have not yet read. It whispers to the cataloguer checking one last date and to the teacher who tells a student that citation is a civic act. Above all, it teaches humility. The oldest catalogues burned. The first school of schools closed. What remains survived because copyists counted lines, donors paid for roofs, and readers believed that a page is a promise. In Alexandria itself, the emblem returned to stone. On the shore east of the ancient harbor, a modern building rose, its name deliberately chosen. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened like a sun cut into the earth, its walls carved with scripts from many languages, its reading room vast as a plaza. It holds books, galleries, and classrooms. But its deeper claim is symbolic. A modern city declared its willingness to carry an ancient task, to gather, to teach, to lend, to invite, to digitize against flood and fire, to seat scholars and children at the same tables, to act as a bridge between past and present, between local memory and a shared human archive. The building on the shore is not the ancient library. That distinction matters. It is not a ghost to be mourned, but something far more useful. It is a reminder that the correct response to loss is labor. What finally defines a legacy is not what once existed, but what ordinary people choose to do with what remains. A mother in Nairobi opens a free digital catalog and helps her child sound out the names of Greek gods. A student in Kyoto scrolls through a Syriac Aristotle on a phone while waiting for a tram. A curator in Alexandria uploads ultra-high-resolution images of a papyrus so that a graduate student in Buenos Aires can zoom into a torn edge and argue for a better reading. A city librarian in Louisville stands before a council and insists that Sunday hours are a matter of public safety, citing teenage reading patterns as evidence. In each of these small acts, there is an echo from a shaded court where scholars once shared meals beneath fig trees and argued over a disputed line of Homer. Alexandria taught the world something easily forgotten: a library is not a trophy. It is a system. It is a promise made by the living to those not yet born, that the record will be kept as carefully as possible, and that mistakes will be corrected in the open. That promise held in a royal quarter lit by oil lamps, in monastic rooms warmed by winter sun, in caliphal palaces glowing with glass lamps, in Venetian print shops smelling of metal and ink, and now on screens lit by diodes. The materials change. The vow does not. Begin in the sand. Begin under the water. That is where the city continues to speak. The story of the library survives not only in polished histories, but in fragments left by people who never imagined an audience. Pottery shards scratched with quick accounts. Tax receipts folded and tied with string. A lecture hall whose steps still carry the hollowed imprint of thousands of sandals. The afterlife of Alexandria is an investigation, conducted with notebooks, cameras, patience, and the willingness to let a small fact revise a grand narrative. On the hill now crowned by a single granite column, later centuries misnaming it for Pompeii, 19th century excavators uncovered colossal fragments and forests of broken bases. Here once stood a vast temple complex, and here a daughter library stored books in cedar-lined cupboards. Around the column's base, pavements worn smooth tell of constant traffic. Service corridors hint at porters carrying crates. Beneath modern apartments below the hill, archaeologists trace stairways and galleries suggesting storerooms and classrooms. Inscribed stones reappear in garden walls, reused and half forgotten. Each fragment is a sentence in a document that time attempted to erase. Across the city, at Com El Dika, the ground offered something close to a miracle. Construction workers uncovered rows of stepped auditoria, brick classrooms faced with limestone, dating to the Roman and late Roman periods. Dozens of teaching rooms stood side by side, a campus frozen midterm. The benches and apses speak plainly. When the royal quarter weakened, learning did not vanish. It relocated. Grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics continued to be taught to students who kept the civic engine running. These rooms remember voices reading Homer aloud, and the soft scrape of a stylus across wax. Follow the trail toward the water and the inquiry sinks beneath the surface. In the eastern harbor, divers map columns and foundations by touch and fading green light. Storms and slow geological shifts have altered the coastline since antiquity. Parts of the royal quarter and the island palace of Cleopatra now lie underwater. Archaeology has traced key walls, massive platforms, and shattered statuary that likely stood near the precincts where scholars once dined. This is not the library itself. It is the city that made a library possible. Harbors, causeways, and disciplined stonework mattered as much as catalogues. Beyond Alexandria, the desert performs its own quiet preservation. At Oxyrhynchus, the rubbish heaps of an ordinary town yielded thousands of papyri, poems by Sappho, scenes from Menander, fragments of lost historians, school exercises still bearing a teacher's corrections. These were not ceremonial library copies. They show that the habit of copying had seeped into everyday life. A book made for a local reader could be discarded, buried, and rediscovered 2 millennia later under laboratory lights. The desert became an accidental archivist, offering a rebuttal to the myth of total catastrophe. When one shelf disappeared, others elsewhere kept the words alive. Another line of inquiry follows methods rather than objects. How do we know Callimachus mapped literature? Because later writers cite the Pinarches as an authority. How do we know Caesar's fire-damaged book storage near the docks? Because ancient authors independently describe the loss, and later historians repeat the smoke across their own pages. How do we know the Serapeum fell under an imperial edict enforced by a crowd? Because opposing witnesses described the same year, the same act, with different voices but matching facts. History withholds a final inventory, but it offers converging testimony. The work is to weigh it openly. The trail is linguistic as well. Greek leads, but the relay continues through Syriac, Arabic, and Latin. Greek science traveled into Syriac monasteries along trade routes linking Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Baghdad, translators rendered medicine and mathematics into Arabic with care and ambition. Physicians compared multiple Greek exemplars against Syriac versions before producing texts meant to be trusted. This was not nostalgia for a fallen city. It was the continuation of an Alexandrian belief that precision is a civic virtue. When medieval Europe sought Aristotle and Galen, it often found them through Arabic intermediaries. The chain of custody is the inheritance. Modern tools extend the same logic. Charred scrolls from Herculaneum can now be read without unrolling, using subtle density differences inside carbonized layers. Multispectral imaging restores ink long invisible on Egyptian papyri. Digital platforms reunite fragments scattered across continents by script, hand, and content. Catalogues that began on tablets now reside on servers. A student can search every surviving witness to a line of Herodotus in seconds and inspect photographs of the earliest copies. Alexandria's oldest problem was how to find the right roll. The newest solution is to let catalogues speak at the speed of light. The city's myth still invites imagination, and responsible history makes room for it. One can picture a morning before the final disruptions, librarians checking harbor lists, sacks of seized books carried to copy rooms, a lector clearing his throat as scribes begin. Down a corridor, a physician lectures on the pulse. In a courtyard, a mathematician sketches ratios in sand. A courier arrives with a letter folded in wax, carrying questions about the Nile's flood. Scholars rise as a prince passes, because even brilliance depends on patronage. The day ends with recitation and debate. Nothing in this scene contradicts the evidence. It gives flesh to receipts and decrees. Questions remain. Where exactly were the earliest halls within the Brucheian? How dispersed was the collection by the time of Aurelian? How were Egyptian ritual texts catalogued beside Homer? Were there rooms dedicated to scripts other than Greek? How many rolls were unique works rather than duplicates? Each answer demands restraint. Alexandria was never one building or one moment. It was a system stretched across streets and centuries. The moral weight of the story belongs to the present. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina stands near the ancient harbor as a declaration that memory can be policy. Its reading room gathers daylight like an amphitheater. Its walls bear scripts from many languages as a carved pledge. It funds preservation and digitization not as ornament, but as obligation. The goal is not to resurrect ancient glory, but to continue the work that made the ancient city useful to strangers. A librarian in Alexandria today makes the same vow as one under Ptolemy, to keep the record, to make it findable, to share it with anyone who asks in good faith. There is romance in that vow, and arithmetic as well. Papyrus decays. Roofs fail. Politics can turn scholars into targets. The only reliable defense is multiplication and dispersal, anchored by public catalogues and public funding. Alexandria learned this early when it sent copies abroad. The world learned it again through monasteries, translation houses, presses, and now distributed digital archives. The more copies in more places, the harder it is for silence to win. The library's final chapter is not a lament. It is a manual. It tells cities that wish to be more than markets to build rooms where the young learn to read carefully. It tells governments that schools and libraries are infrastructure, not decoration. It tells readers that a clean note in the margin is a public gift. It tells scholars that citation is gratitude. And it tells every citizen that the cost of memory is small compared to the price of forgetting.